Hey guys, AK here, bringing you another tips and tricks video in conjunction with bassgorilla.com. Bassgorilla.com is a website that teaches electronic music production. They have courses by famous artists such as Haywire, Variant, Seamless, and many others. They also have a YouTube channel called Bassgorilla TV that you can check out too. For this video, we're talking about Saturn, a multi-band distortion plugin made by Fabfilter. If you've never heard of Saturn or Fabfilter, stop living under a rock, check out their site, and snag a demo. Here's the link. Distortion has a lot of different applications in modern electronic music, and Saturn is one of my favorite plugins for distortion. There's a ton you can do with it. When you first open the plugin, Saturn might not look complicated. The Fabfilter developers did a really good job with functional design, but under the hood, there's some awesome and less obvious features in this little window. This video is going to explore some techniques in musical context that I like to use when I reach for Saturn in my workflow. Tip 1. Multi-band distortion is exactly as it sounds. You can create bands in the frequency spectrum and distort them differently. Create a band by hitting the plus sign and drag it to where you want it in the frequency spectrum. And then you can tune the level and the distortion type along with the drive amount for each distortion unit independently on each band. What's so cool about Saturn is that you can modulate the crossover point here that you've drawn straight in your DAW. Essentially, you can control what's distorted, how it's distorted, and where the split between the distortions occurs as it changes the incoming signal over time. Changing this crossover point over time can have some awesome sound design applications. One such application is to implement a pseudo filter sweep by moving the crossover point, where you might normally go for a band pass filter or a band reject filter. Instead, grab Saturn and try making a moderately distorted or saturated band and keep the other band mostly clean. And then move the crossover point as your primary modulation source for that effect. Sweeping up and down will add cool textures and harmonics in different places in your sound. And if you implement modulation stepper style here, you'll get some interesting jagged breaks. Tip 2. Now let's take the same concept but apply it in a more complex way. What I basically want to do is to create one super distorted, narrow band in the middle of my signal. So I'll insert two dividers here and make the midband super narrow. Now I'll distort the hell out of this little band and try a couple of different distortion modes to hear which brings out the best harmonics of my incoming signal. For the next part, I'm going to leverage macros in Ableton, but most modern DAWs should have a functional equivalent. If yours doesn't, you might want to reevaluate why you're still using it. Essentially, we are mapping the left side of this band to move lower in the frequency spectrum when we lower the value of the knob, and doing the opposite on the right-hand side of the band. Ostensibly, I've created a band that lets me narrow the distorted band as I move the knob up, sort of like squashing the sound and having it converge at a point. It takes a little bit of fine-tuning to find the right values here, but I always like to think about the convergent point, i.e. when the knob is all the way up, and the divergent point, when the knob is all the way down. If you tune these sounds musically, this usually yields good results for the entire movement of the knob. As an additional mapping, for the sake of dynamics, you could also map Saturn's overall dry-wet to the same macro, so that as you squash, you distort more. I like this because when you're done, you have one knob that does a bunch of stuff and could be easily saved for later use on other material. Tip 3. I'm a fan of making things from scratch, but Fabfilter has some kind of smart interpolation technology which makes it super smooth at transitioning between presets. I've noticed this on all of the Fabfilter plugins, but particularly on Saturn. Specifically, there are some really wacky sounds in the sequence category under the presets. So, for instance, load up a drum loop, send it through Saturn, go to the sequence category, set up a resampling track, and press record to resample. And now, just click through the presets on the beat or off the beat of your song. It's kind of like using the mouse to create music, but you'll just love some of the glitchy sounds that come out of this. Tip 4. Saturn, and distortion in general, isn't just for highly destructive sounds. It's also a really useful mixing tool for adding a touch of grit or brightness to make things sparkle or sit just right. Let's have a look at two such applications. Here, we'll use Saturn to add some distortion to the snare, to make it crunch at just the right place. 220, 250, whatever your pleasure. You can draw the bands as wide or narrow as you'd like to fit the context of your song. For a second application, let's try thickening up this sub-bass, very slightly with some gentle saturation, and also using a high band and lowering the gain to cut out the highs, rather than doing this with an EQ. I'd also bring your attention to 3 mixing style presets that are built into Saturn that I seriously love. Tip 5. All the Fabfilter plugins have a fairly similar modulation interface that sits below the primary window. Here you'll find all sorts of envelope generators, XY paths, and more. If you're already competent with Fabfilter's approach to modulation, well, then you're good to go. For me, I find it to be very hard to conceptualize modulation in Fabfilter plugins because I'm spoiled by things like Razor and Serum, which show me how stuff moves when it's moving. Anyway, here's what I do 99% of the time. I'll pretty much ignore everything except the XLFO because LFOs are ubiquitous and for me the easiest to understand, sculpt, and conceptualize. The XLFO is pretty much like a classic LFO, but it can do much more. It can also be used as a 16-step sequencer with individual glide for each step. Anyway, to add XLFO as a modulation source in a patch, click the plus button in the source selection bar and click New XLFO. At the left of the XLFO interface, you will find global parameters that affect the entire waveform. I'm going to quote the manual here because it actually explains the XLFO really well. For the illustrative example, I'll just make something really distorted and send our XLFO to the dry wet of Saturn so it's obvious what it's doing. Alright. Frequency. The frequency knob sets the time it takes for one cycle of the waveform to complete. This knob is a modulation target. The XLFO can be synchronized to the tempo of the plugin host or set to run free. With the options at the top right corner of the frequency button, you can choose the different settings. Free running mode will allow for values from 0.02 to 500 Hz, so the minimum cycle length is 0.002 seconds. When using any of the synchronized cycle lengths, like 16 to 1/64th, the frequency knob changes into the offset knob. It now acts like a cycle length multiplier and therefore is capable of changing the cycle length relative to the host tempo. Balance. The outer ring of the frequency knob adjusts the time balance of the first and last halves of the step sequencer. For example, when turned to the left, the first half of the waveform is generated more quickly than the last half. I'm going to ignore MIDI sync because, well, I never use it. Glide. The global glide knob acts like an overall glide offset. The amount of glide determines the point within a step at which the XLFO starts to interpolate the value of the next step. The global glide value is added to the glide value for individual steps to arrive at the final glide value for each step. The final glide value is limited between 0, no interpolation, and 1, full interpolation. I hope that makes it easier for you to get more comfortable with modulation in Saturn, or any Fabfilter plugin really. Go for the XLFO, and just play with stuff. Tip 6. Saturn claims to support sidechaining natively for each DAW. Here are the instructions for Ableton. And the manual has different instructions for different DAWs. However, I find this explanation to be completely confusing. Here's how I do sidechaining with Saturn. I apologize in advance, this is a sort of Ableton-centric workflow, but I'm sure there are ways of implementing this concept in other DAWs. So put Saturn in a rack, create another chain, and put a gate in there. Now turn sidechaining on and turn the blue headphones on in the gate, and then select whatever source that you want to sidechain to. Next, add an envelope follower to this rack, which when you add it, you will see is tracking whatever the incoming audio source is here that we selected in the sidechain of the gate. Now if we mute this rack, the gate and the envelope follower on it, and fine-tune the settings of the envelope follower if necessary, we're seeing a modulation curve that makes sense for our use, the sidechaining use, And in line, we can map the envelope follower to any parameter in Saturn. Maybe the dry wet. Boom. Inline sidechaining modulation. And you can duplicate the envelope follower here, change its settings if you want, and do different kinds of sidechain modulation to different parameters on Saturn. So I realize this tip will actually work for any VST, but I'd particularly like to add sidechaining distortion to my subs and my basses, specifically if I'm dealing with a standard 4-on-the-floor groove. Tip 7. Want to make your own random presets in Saturn? So draw a ton of bands. Make sure your DAW knows about each of them. In Ableton, you have to press Configure and move a parameter so that it appears here. And now we're going to bust out this Max for Live device randomizer. And we're going to seed it to Saturn. Each time you seed, you'll get totally randomized distortion with tons of bands that get moved around all over the place. Sound shitty? Run it through again. Remember that randomness can be your ally. Also, this Max for Live device is amazing for jumbling up devices. Tip 8. In case you didn't get it when you first opened Saturn, the red on the interface means more gain in that band, and the ghosted particles show you where Saturn is adding or subtracting frequencies. If everything is off, Saturn will still show you the various partials of the incoming audio and split them across the frequency spectrum. Rarely, but sometimes, I'll put Saturn on my master track with a dry wet of 0 and use it as a simple monitoring tool. I realize this was not really intended for this purpose, but I kind of like how simple it looks, and that most of the stereo analyzers can help you see a pretty simple visual of where peaks and valleys are in your tune, which can really help with mixing and mastering decisions. I don't know why I would never leave it on the master, just to sort of get a quick monitor. And I think probably most would argue that ProQ is much better for this, but meh. Tip 9. I love exploiting A/B modes in plugins whenever I'm designing a patch from scratch. Most people will use the B mode to test changes that they've made to A, so they don't lose their original settings. This works, but I like to actually use this mode to switch between two drastically different patches in one click. Again, Saturn's smart interpolation technology makes rapidly switching between A and B sound much smoother than it does in most plugins. So I make a patch in A, make another ridiculous patch. And then combo smash them together when resampling for a cool result. Note that the combo smash tends to sound better with high quality or oversampling enabled. And if anyone can figure out how to get the A-B switch to be triggered via MIDI messages rather than the mouse, let me know. I've got a MIDI fighter on my desk, and I just want to combo mash arcade buttons all day long. Tip 10. I've noticed a very interesting and almost synergistic relationship between the dynamics and feedback module of each distortion unit within Saturn. What they do is different depending on which distortion module is selected, but here's what the manual says. The feedback amount knob sets the level of feedback for that band, which feds the processed audio back into the input of the band. The feedback frequency knob sets the ringing frequency of the feedback loop. You can simply compare this to the distance of a microphone, which picks up the signal of an amplifier that outputs its own signal. The closer the mic gets to the speaker, the higher the ringing of the frequency. The dynamics knob can be used to either gate or compress the band signal. Turning the knob to the right will add heavily pumping compression, while turning the knob to the left will introduce great all-purpose gating and expansion. Trippy, but cool. One useful application here is to make a macro knob which decreases dynamics while increasing feedback, or vice versa, however you like to think about it. To use Fabfilter's analogy, we are expanding as we lower feedback and compressing as we expand. I find this to be effective mostly when using single band patches, but it can also be cool with multi-band patches, though you'll probably want to map the feedback dynamics of each of the bands to its own knob. Remember that you can mute and solo individual bands when creating these mappings. That's all I have for you today. I hope you found some of these tips useful and relevant to your own workflows. Big ups to Zenflex for getting me involved with his community. Now get out there and make music. Listen to my music too.